All right, hello, hello. Hopefully the microphone is working. Welcome. So basically, we are in authoritarian states, right? And we're in the blue Hitler chapter. So I feel like we got to before summer break started, we got to the end of 4.2. It was possible one of you maybe not have been in class that last lesson. I can't remember if it was who it was. I shouldn't say names maybe on here. Anyway, so I'm pretty sure we finished 4.2. So that gets us to page 209. And we're not really going to have a whole lot of time when we get back before the mock exams in early September. So I wanted to go ahead and do 4.3 here on video. It'll maybe take two. I'm going to start my timer now on my phone here. And I'm going to do 45 minutes because I know, if the video gets much longer than that, it's first of all, it's a big file. And I know you guys your attention will waver. So I'm going to go ahead and do 45 minutes. And here we go. Um, and, we'll see where we're at. And maybe we'll have to make a second video. I can almost guarantee because it's a long chapter. This chapter goes all the way to starts on 210 and it ends on 227. Okay. So I'm just going to kind of go through and point out some highlights on each page, information, add some information. So have your book open, get ready to take some notes, and I hopefully won't ask too many open-ended questions, and we'll just go through it. Of course, respond to this video with questions and or ask me in class. So when we get back, I think we have one class on the 26th, and that's it. And then we start mock exams on what, like the 28th or something. So uh, you need to come to class prepared on the 26th with questions about paper one, which I think we decided it was Germany, right? And paper two, wars. You need to ask me anything you feel like you need to ask me. And paper two, Germany, Hitler, which is the only, we still have to do Mao and Castro in here, but let's get through the rest of Hitler at this point. Okay, so the aims and results of Nazi policies. Key question: to what extent did Nazi domestic policies help to keep the regime in power? Something to think about as we go through. So when we're talking about policies, we're often talking about domestic and foreign. What did Hitler do inside Germany? And what did Hitler do outside of Germany? How did he relate to other countries? And what were some of his goals? Aims means goals, right? What was he trying to get done? Obviously, before the war started, then the goal was to win the war. Um, which, I think some of the higher ups as we know, when we studied opposition in the previous unit, 4.2, some of the higher ups, when we talked about, for instance, the Valkyrie plot to kill Hitler, they realized that Germany was never going to win the war once the Americans joined, right? The production capability of the United States in the 1940s, once they joined the war for real in 1942, Pearl Harbor happened December 7th, 1941 and America starts to literally millions of young men went to sign up to fight. And we talked about how you could get sent two places. You're 19, 20, 21 years old, you volunteer to be in the military because of what happened at Pearl Harbor, and America is going to join the fight. You could either get sent to the Pacific to fight the Japanese, or you could get sent to Europe to help Britain, basically one of the few countries left at that point, because France had been invaded and captured, to help the British fight against Hitler and the Nazis in Europe. And the Italians, to some extent, Mussolini and the Italians are part of the Axis powers. So you get the idea. So you could be sent, but they really were kind of, it was half and half. Um, so they were committing, it wasn't like they were just going to respond to Pearl Harbor and really put all their efforts into the Pacific. No, they were putting a lot of manpower and materials into the fight in Europe against Hitler. So we have to look at so could Hitler have won the war? He maybe he thought so in 1939. Of course, we know from our study that he never thought that the Allies would actually defend Poland. He had done Anschluss, he had done the Rhineland, he had done the Sudetenland. Nobody pushed back, right? He had no reason to believe that when the British and the French said, "Look, that's it. This is the line in the sand. Don't cross this line. Don't invade Poland, or else we're gonna have to, declare war." And he thought, no, why would they defend Poland? It's like a non-democratic Far Eastern country, more so than they would, X or Y. And that's where they decided to draw the line, and that's when the war started. We're coming up on the anniversary, September 1st, 1939, of course. Okay, page 210. Hitler's domestic policies from 33 to 45. Again, you guys know why we picked 33. The book picks 33. That's because that's when Hitler becomes chancellor and takes over Germany. Okay, 45. I think I don't need to say it, but I will. End of the war, right? Hitler kills himself in the bunker in Berlin, and Germany surrenders, and the war in Europe ends in 1945. Okay, so for those 12 years, what were Hitler's domestic policies? Okay, so we know that he rises up, takes over being chancellor through various means, and we talked about this a lot. I'm not going to repeat it, but the enabling acts and other things, Night of the Long Knives. He becomes the sole leader of Germany, the dictator, and then they start to do everything to make sure the Nazis are in complete control of the country of Germany. Okay? But there are problems. Okay? We talked about how Gustav Stresemann, in his miraculous recovery of Germany in the late 20s, and then the two things that happened in 1929. Gustav dies unexpectedly, and the Great Depression starts in October of 1929. This plunges Germany into turmoil, and just because Hitler, is able to take advantage of that and get himself votes and get himself appointed chancellor and get into power, that doesn't mean all the bad things that were happening in Germany went away. Okay. That just means he was able to take advantage of that weakness of the Weimar Republic and the situation. Okay, sorry, my eyelash is going crazy over here. Um, and get put into power. There is still, though, economic problems. Um, One of the pressing economic problems was unemployment. Okay, the Great Depression, this is not unique to Germany. Every country, especially, I guess what we would call first world country, most European countries, the United States, Canada, Japan, experienced unemployment because of the Great Depression. So they say it stood around 6 million people unemployed in 19 when Hitler came to power. Is that a period? Oh, I can't read my own book. Oh no, it's a semicolon. Okay. So when he came to power, about 6 million people unemployed. Now, what does that mean, 6 million? When you read a statistic like that, you have to remember context, right? So what you have to do is go, okay, what 6 million of 100 million, if there were 100 million people in Germany in 1939, would be about 6%. That's not catastrophic. It's bad. Modern day unemployment figures in most modern countries, I think, are around 3 or 4%, just kind of always, right? There's always going to be a section of your population that can't find work or struggling to find work. Anything above, say, 9 or 10%, now you're talking a problem, right? But what was the population of Germany in 1939? What percentage? And I looked it up, and it was about 65 million. So 6% of 65 million is that kind of 10%. So that means one out of every 10 people not in a job. And these aren't people that maybe are elderly or, unable to work because of a disability, maybe a World War I veteran who lost an arm or something. These are people who want to work and just can't find work because the economy is shutting down. Okay? So, um, by 1939, they're saying that in the years from when he took power in 33 and unemployment was 6 million, 10%, to 1939 when the war started, by that time there was actually a labor shortage. So he had been able to find ways domestically inside Germany to put people to work. And this is really a big thing that the German people wanted from him. He had promised it. We talked about how he promised bread and a job. Like that's a famous Nazi slogan when he was campaigning. Okay. Um, but what they're saying in the book is some of that recovery had already started to percolate in Germany as early as 1932. Uh, and a lot of, if you're going to give credit to Hitler for turning Germany around and putting people to work, a big reason that he was able to do that and have jobs for people is because the production, the things they were making in the factories that were employing all these people were goods for the war that Hitler knew was coming. Okay. So they were making um uh they were producing things for a possible war after 1936. So for the last 3 years leading up to September 1st, 1939, they're building a lot of tanks and uh sewing a lot of soldier uniforms and everything you need to do, making bullets, whatever it is that you need to do to get ready for a war. Okay, we're going to talk about the 4-year plan, which I think we talked about a little bit already. That was Herman Goering's uh, attempt. Where is that on the page? Oh, I don't want to spend too much time going back through here looking for it. But yeah, that was another thing. Let's see if we can just find it really quick. No, we're not going to find it very fast. Okay, but look through your notes. Um, it might be coming up actually. Oh, no, it is. Sorry, it's on page 212. It's coming up. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. And this idea of like a 4-year plan or a 5-year plan, this is going to be a big idea when we get to Chairman Mao in China. So kind of keep that in your brain if you want to write a comparison essay. Okay. Um, and when Germany would like give numbers out to the public, or I don't know how much they made these numbers public, but uh, there was whole groups of the population who they would kind of remove, even though they weren't working, from being unemployed, and they would manipulate the numbers to make it look better. And when you think of the Nazis and how manipulative they were in their propaganda and the way they would disseminate information out to the people, what they would hold back, what they would allow to be given out. It's not surprising that they manipulated numbers. Okay. Uh, then it tells you some of the people that were not put on the jobless list. Remember, we talked about how Hitler, when he took over in 33, he wanted to make sure everybody who was working in civil service, working in bureaucracy, working in the government was a loyal Nazi. And he purged, he kicked out, removed a lot of people, and those people weren't put on the jobless list. Some stuff there about women. You can read that on the paragraph on 210. Um, but it says even though they manipulated the figures, job opportunities arose from various government-inspired public works projects. Okay, so remember this term public works projects. What does that mean? That means building things that benefit the public, roads, hospitals, schools, making parks in an area, whatever it might be, affordable housing. I don't think they were doing that in Germany. But FDR is going to do the same thing in America as part of the New Deal to put Americans back to work during the Great Depression. So this is, private companies are suffering, so the government steps in and does projects, putting people to work and paying them a salary to stimulate the economy, to get those people out of poverty, etc. Okay. So he's going to stop following the Treaty of Versailles and not worry about the arms restrictions after 1935. He's been in power for a couple of years. He feels bold enough that he can just say, go away, TOV, and I'm going to start building weapons, and we need to have a strong army, and so he does that, and that, of course, is production that the government is paying for the army, the national army. Okay, so that's defiance of the diktat. We've talked about that. Okay. And there's the famous slogan that I mentioned before, Arbeit und Brot, work and bread, right? He promised the people when he was campaigning that he would put bread on your table and put you back to work if you voted for him and the Nazis. Okay, so they wanted to create jobs. All right, page 210 at the bottom, it says Hitler viewed economic reconstruction as vital for future expansionist plans. So, expansionist plans. What's our favorite L word? Lebensraum. Okay, he's got to. That's his whole goal, right? As early as Mein Kampf, when he writes that book in the 20s, he's talking about expanding, making Germany great again, expanding, taking over, especially to the east. Okay, he's not so much going to try to go to the west. That you've got really well-established countries there. You've got Denmark, you've got the Netherlands, you've got Belgium, but he wants to go east, okay? Um, and he had learned a little bit from the First World War. There was a big Allied blockade where they weren't letting supplies in. They used the water, the Navy to kind of, make sure that no boats could get to German ports, okay? And that, of course, when you're not getting supplies that you need, it's going to slow down your effort to win a war. So he really wanted what Mussolini was looking for when we talked about Mussolini in paper one, which was autarky, right? This idea of self-sufficiency. Okay. So he really wanted, it says at the top of 211, an economy that would avoid dependence on other states. And then it says maintaining power meant finding rapid solutions to immediate problems. So that's a really good sentence. I think you could use that and drop that into an essay. If you're talking about how Hitler maintained his power, because our three stages, remember, rise, consolidation, maintenance. Okay. And so when we're talking now about maintenance, how did he stay in power? How did he keep power? Now some of it was violence, intimidation. There was lots of other ways he maintained power, but one way is to keep his promises, to make the people happy or happier by putting them back to work, by giving them some glimmer of hope that things will get better. Okay. All right. Dun, 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 dun. Again, the next paragraph, it says, under National Socialism, the Nazi program, German industry thrived, got really good, prospered, got better in a period of enforced political stability, a trade union free environment with lucrative government orders that provided profits for business. So, this is where famously some of the companies you've heard of in modern day, like Volkswagen, BMW, which is Bavarian Motor Works, a German company, they, for instance, built uh, vehicles and military equipment for the Nazis in World War II and made a lot of money doing that. Other private companies, same. Um, So in the movie Schindler's List, okay, the German man Oskar Schindler, um, one of the ways he's able to help the Jewish people that he decides to help is he opens a factory making things that you need for the war, and he brings over the camp, the concentration camp workers, who most of them are Jewish, and puts them to work. And then, I don't want to tell you what happens in the movie. We'll get there, but so the government would pay private business because maybe they already owned a factory that makes X or Y good that they need. And they'd be like, okay, now make that for us and we'll buy it and pay you to make it. Okay. And what they're talking about there is there was no political unrest. It wasn't like the government was going to change and a new regime or a new party would come to power and say, no, 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 we don't want to do that. We got to follow the TOV. No, 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 no. It was the Nazis all the way, right? And the Nazis said no more trade unions, right? No more like negotiating for better pay or longer lunch break or whatever it is. You go to work, you're happy you have a job, go do it, you know? And so that made the people that own the factories very happy. Okay. Uh, so they wanted to deal with unemployment and get started on rearmament. They started to build railways. Okay, they already had railroads, of course, in Germany before the Great Depression, but even more. And a big thing they started to build was the Autobahn, which is this big highway um, that would crisscross Germany and allow people to drive their car easily from one major city in Germany to another. The ironic thing is that most people didn't own a car in Germany in the late 20s and into the 30s. Okay, cars are still relatively new. They were not cheap, and you had to have gas. There's all kinds of costs. And so maybe rich people had one that drove them around town, and maybe they had a chauffeur, but maybe they weren't going from Berlin to Munich or from here to here, that's 100 kilometers away. And so the Autobahn is, this amazing stretch of road. Even to this day, I think it's well maintained and people enjoy driving on it. But how necessary it was is debatable. Um, uh, the even the army wasn't going to use it. It says here that the military preferred trains and thought tracked vehicles would rip up the road surface and infrastructure. And fracture bridges. Um, so they wanted trains were used to carrying heavy machinery, big cargo, mountains of coal in these big freight cars. So trains were proven to be able to transport large amounts of people and materials. So they relied, at least at that point, on trains. Now, of course, if you blow up the train track, a plane comes in and drops a bomb and blows up the train track, that train quickly becomes worthless until you're able to repair it, right? Um, anyway, okay. So they had uh, money that the government was getting in taxes and other ways, and they kind of stashed some of it to the side secretly. And they had this sort of secret fund to build weapons. Because again, internationally, the optics of looking at it, Germany was not supposed to be rearming. Okay, and when they started to do that, and of course, the other things we've talked about, remilitarizing the Rhineland, taking over the Sudetenland, this is when, other countries started to say, hey, 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 what are you doing, Germany? Okay, how am I doing? Okay, I got about 20 minutes in this, but I've only done 2 pages, so this is sad. All right, I'll try to go a little faster. I mean, you can see how much I've highlighted, okay, just in those first 2 pages. So it is a lot of information in here for this section. Okay, so public works projects, it says some of the things they were building: houses, schools, hospitals, canals, bridges, railways, the motorway. Okay, so they put people to work. Um, At first, you could volunteer to help with this and get a job. After a while, it became compulsory for all Germans between 19 and 25 to join this group called the RAD, the State Labor Service, and help Germany get ready, well, get it out of economic uh, trouble and to help get it, get ready for war. Okay. We see a shot like that in the movie that we talked about called Triumph of the Will, when there's this huge Nazi rally in Nuremberg, and a lot of the guys are marching along in uniforms, and some of them have rifles and stuff, but a lot of them you'll see like they're walking in and over their shoulder they have a shovel. Like they're like the workers, and they're all there to support Hitler and cheer for him. Okay. Yeah, it talks about the Nuremberg Party rally at the bottom of the page. 50,000 members of the RAD um, standing in the early spotlight of the sun, blah, blah, blah. So she captured that, Leni Riefenstahl, the director of Triumph of the Will, and put that into the movie. Okay, so now I'm on 212. We're at Goering's 4-year plan. Um, so this is introduced in October of 36. So it would have gone into 1940 if it had been able to go all the way, but obviously the war started and then, things changed a lot. But yeah, just know, maybe make a little note in the white margin on 212, to think about comparing this to Mao and his 5-year plans when we get to Mao. Okay, so the big change is that these 4-year plans are a lot about war-related industrial production. All right. Uh, Hitler said there is only one interest, the interest of the nation, only one view, the bringing of Germany to the point of political and economic self-sufficiency. Okay, so he wants to be able to produce enough goods, they don't have to look for other countries for help, and he wants to be able to be producing enough food and things like that. So it says two main tasks had to be achieved. The German army had to get back up to good strength, and the economy must be fit for war within 4 years. So the economy had to be strong enough to help Germany win the war. Okay, after the devastation of the Great Depression, now we have to start to build and build. Okay, so the goals of this plan were never reached. Obviously, the war started, and then, Germany lost the war. But in certain specific areas, they had goals that they wanted to achieve, like how much aluminum are we producing? How many explosives are we making? How much coal are we digging out of the earth? Um, all this kind of stuff. So, um, part of this, one of the historians in our book says, is why the Germans developed this blitzkrieg, lightning fast war idea that they didn't want to get in a long conflict. They wanted to get in, you know, punish and fight hard, really all at the beginning, win the battle, and then just deal with occupying that area, etc. So they relied on quick victories, and they hoped that they would gain much needed resources in the area they were attacking, and they could then use those for the next attack, right? The next campaign. They didn't want what happened in World War One, which we've talked about this word a lot, which is a war of attrition. They didn't want to have kind of a stalemate. Oh, you win this day, the other country fights back, wins the next day. You go back and forth, and nobody's really winning anything. That's trench warfare. That's World War One. They don't want a repeat of that. Okay. Um, but it says that they've done studies and they estimate that by 1939, when the war started, Germany was still reliant on external sources for around 1/3 of its raw materials. So they were still getting 33% about of things like oil, timber, whatever it was that they needed to make things. Maybe food is part of that equation. Because Germany doesn't grow everything that they need. They can do fishing. They're on the Baltic Sea. They have, big fields and are able to grow lots of food, but maybe they can't do everything. They don't have vast cattle ranges like America does or something. But anyway, one third of what they need is coming from outside Germany. Okay. Um, okay, so there is a problem that even though Hitler's a dictator and he can tell people what to do and he can direct your energies and your job life to very specific goals, it says one cannot at the same time simultaneously increase armaments for the land and air forces forever. You can't also build up a massive battle fleet, build ships, fortify new extended borders, build gigantic installations for the production of war materials, construct big, huge buildings and monuments to Nazism in Berlin that, are like a brand new Reichstag or whatever, and uh, tear down huge parts of the city. You can't, you can do some of those things, but you can't do all of them all at the same time, is what he's saying. One can either do one or the other, or a little bit of everything, but not everything at the same time and in unlimited dimensions. So it's great to have goals, to have this 4-year plan, to have the idea that we're going to do all these great things, but you got to have the people and the materials to do that and the time, right? So there's still limits. Just because Hitler wanted it done doesn't mean that it could get done. Okay? So, for example, we talked about what did they start making in most factories? War goods. But that means they're making less of what? Well, consumer goods, things that you need as a human to live your life, blankets, furniture, maybe cars that people could afford for daily life, whatever it was. Okay. Real wages of German workers were less impressive. Okay. And shortages of consumer products and wages were kind of frozen at the 1933 level. But people were, for the most part, okay with that because they had a job. It was like, well, so many people, and they had news. They read what was happening in England and France and the United States. They saw how devastating the Great Depression was in countries outside of Germany. So maybe they were just happy to have work, even though they weren't really getting paid enough to save money or plan for the future, whatever. They were just getting by day to day, paycheck to paycheck. And they weren't, even if they had a little extra money and wanted to go buy a new bed or something like, there weren't any to be bought because everything was being made for the war. Um, so the quote at the very bottom of 212 says, the workers had been unemployed for 4, 5, even 6 years when Hitler took over, and they would have hired on with Satan himself. So the devil, they would have worked for the devil at that point just to have a job. Okay. All right. So we're going to do 213, and we'll probably stop at the bottom of 214. So we'll do two more pages. Cultural and social policies. Um, like I said, they got rid of trade unions. You were not allowed to go on strike. You're not allowed to stop working for better conditions or better pay. That was all banned. That would have been reinforced with the SS and, intimidation and things like that. If there was even murmurings of it on the factory floor, you'd probably get punished or beat up if you were saying anything like that. And if you did try it, you could get arrested and put in jail, and worse, maybe sent to a concentration camp. Um, so that all started in 33. They talk a little bit about the KDF, the Kraft durch Freude movement. And you can read about that in the little box on page 213 there. Um, so it says that workers were kind of reduced to thinking merely of working and adequate nourishment, like getting enough food for them and their families. And that's really all they could think about. Okay. Um, Loss of personal freedom under the Nazi regime was compensated for by perceived material benefits that were enjoyed in comparison to the last years of Weimar. Okay. So, and then what they talk about is kind of this interesting thing in the next paragraph, and that's if you were German and white and, Aryan and you fit the Nazi model, you weren't Jewish, you weren't a gypsy, you weren't a homosexual, you weren't a communist, any of those things that would have got maybe you sent away, you perceived your social reality is actually pretty good. Um, you wouldn't have necessarily thought about how bad it was, maybe compared to, you know, the Gustav Stresemann days or pre-World War One, right? Um, and you got to remember a lot of the people that were young adults and maybe even in their 30s, they had lived through World War One. They had lived through the beginning of the Great Depression. So they had lived through some really harsh times. After World War One was a terrible time in Germany, right? We know hyperinflation and all that stuff. So they 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 perhaps knew that their rights were being controlled and manipulated by this dictator, but their lives weren't so bad, right? And we're going to talk about one of the things that he did for them, which was these kind of like, well, this is the KDF. Uh, they they gave them these leisure retreats, kind of like these little mini vacations. And here's some of the things they offered when you went to one of these places. They were kind of like resorts in Germany. Germany is a beautiful country and, forests and mountains and stuff. Um, so there was sports. You could go watch theater, folk dancing, excursions by train. They would even go to foreign countries and come back to Germany, hiking, cruises on ocean liners, and they would all be kind of given. Now, this was mostly to probably the higher ranked German officers in the Nazi political machine, etc. And then, of course, we get that word at the end that I shouldn't try to pronounce, Volkenmeinschaft. The German people, right, are trying, what do they get? And they would dangle it like a carrot, hey, achieve your, make this many bullets, 2 tons of bullets at your factory, the manager would be told, and you get to go for a week to this, pleasure camp. And, all your meals are paid for, and we'll pay for your train ticket. And so that's one of the things they did. Okay. Dun, 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 dun. Okay. The Nazi wartime economy now they're talking about. And we're going to get into something here that's an interesting debate when we talk about as historians and we look back at Germany and Hitler, and we have intentionalists and structuralists. Okay. And this is kind of heavy, and I probably need to tell you about this in person when we're in class. I can write some stuff up on the board because it's kind of a hard concept and it's not hugely important, but it is interesting. So I'll save that section of the bottom of 213, um, and we'll talk about it in class. Okay. Uh, all right. Don't need to worry about anything else there on 213. Let's flip over to 214. Uh, okay. So now they're talking about once the war started, how did they get things done? How did the Nazis pay for things? How did they respond when they needed more soldiers or more workers, or where did they get those people, etc. So it says that unfortunately, the Nazi failure to establish a central wartime administration from the beginning of the war, the outset, hampered successful mobilization of the nation's resources and war effort. So what they didn't do was kind of recognize on September 1st, 1939, or very shortly thereafter, okay, we've just started something. This is not going to be over in 6 months. Now, remember, we talked about how at the very beginning of World War II in Europe, there was the phony war. People were like, are we really having a war? Like, sort of a lot happened, and now it's winter and nobody's doing anything. But then, of course, in 1940, Germany's going to attack England, and the war, they're going to attack France, and the war is really going to get underway. And what they didn't do is maybe set up a central uh, agency to take care of all the logistics of, okay, how do we send materials to this place? Okay, what do we need? How many men do you need? Okay, we'll go get them from there and we'll put them here and blah, blah, blah. So uh, they had, example is this guy who was the minister of munitions. Munitions means war weapons, guns, artillery, tanks, bullets. But he had no control over the production of aircraft because that would have maybe gone under the Luftwaffe, right? The leader of the Luftwaffe, which was Hermann Goering. So, and if making airplanes and stuff for airplanes is, as it says here in the book, 2/5 of your war production, then it's like 40% of your money is being allocated to this thing which this guy had no control over, even though he was supposed to be in charge of the whole Nazi war-making machinery. Um, Also, they say another thing that the Germans did was they loved these new high-tech weapons that were coming out, like rockets. One of the things they develop is rockets. High quality weapons that were expensive in terms of labor costs and materials, where they should have maybe for maybe one all the money it took them to develop and build and test the rockets, they could have built, 100 artillery guns or something. I'm just making that number up, but you get the idea. So they maybe should have put the technology on the back burner during the war and just made more practical things. Okay. Talks a little bit more about the 4-year plan, the Blitzkrieg, how they were really successful, the Germans, at the beginning of the war. From 39 to 41, they took over most of Europe. But it says here a long drawn out war would be difficult for Germany to sustain. Okay. Especially when Hitler, and we've talked about this mistake a lot, couldn't figure out a way to invade England. He couldn't crack it and get his troops on the ground in England. And so he gave up in a sense and turned and decided to start Operation Barbarossa and attack the Soviet Union. So now he's fighting on two fronts. He's got to split his troops and materials, and he's taking on a country with just unlimited people, really, that Stalin could throw into the war effort. Okay. Mm, Also, you're going to have, situations like in France, where he takes over Paris and he takes over France, and they set up Vichy France, Vichy. You know about that, right? And they put that general from World War I, Pétain, in charge. And he's supposed to make France, like a place that Germany can rely on for materials and things. But there's going to be an underground. There's going to be Charles de Gaulle escapes and goes lives in England, the leader of the French underground, and they're going to attack, German generals when they're at cafes, or they're going to, try to blow up and use sabotage against industry and things. So it's not like you've secured that place and there's no more fighting going on. It's not large scale like an army, but it's still disrupting what you're trying to get done if you're a German. Uh, and it says here, I think one of the good quotes that I put a little asterisk by on page 214 is Hitler's forces arrived not as liberators of the people of the USSR, for example, but as conquerors whose intention was to subjugate the population. So it's one thing if you're coming into a country and kind of like he did a little bit in the Sudetenland. Remember the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia? He wants to take back those areas where the people feel ethnically German, speak German. And so those people, the people in the Rhineland as well, welcomed Hitler when he came into their area. They're like, yay, we want to be part of Germany again. Most people in Austria, they didn't really have a choice, but they went along with Anschluss. And that's, of course, where Hitler was born in Austria. But when he went to the Soviet Union, he wasn't like, hey, throw off your communist overlords and let's have, a great Soviet Union. He's not there to liberate them and make them free. He's there to make them work for him and to take all that they have and leave nothing behind for them. So that's a very different thing. Okay. Gordon Wright, it says in the middle of the page, argued that the Nazis could. Oh, there's my time. Okay, so I'll finish up here. Could in the occupied territories of Eastern and Western Europe have chosen to collaborate with the conquered people? Okay, Polish people, let's work together and we'll cut you in on the deal and blah blah blah. But we know from the Nazi Soviet pact that there was a secret plan that Hitler never meant to honor, but where he was going to split Poland in half with Stalin. Uh, but instead, their simpler policy of smash and grab alienated the occupied populations and led to failure to benefit from the vast resources of a militarily underestimated Soviet state. And we talked about what the Soviets did in response when they retreated from battles because the Nazis were superior militarily, at least at the beginning of the war. They had better, strategy and equipment and trained soldiers and whatnot is they did that scorched earth policy. So as they retreated, they would burn the villages down to the ground. They would kill all the cattle. They would, no, they wouldn't leave behind any pigs or whatever, nothing for the German soldiers to benefit from. No food, no shelter, no materials. And that's the way, Russia's such a huge country that they could retreat, 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 and do that to a certain extent and Germany was not getting any benefit from invading and taking over this land. Um, okay. And then we have an interesting line here. It says by 1942, okay, again, this is the year America really gets involved. One of the leaders of the Nazis, TODT, I don't know how you pronounce his name, uh, informed Hitler that the result of the expansion of the war against the USA rendered victory impossible. But this guy, TODT, I don't know his full name. I should. Um, oh, there it is. Fritz Todt, the Minister of Munitions, at the top of the page. So he's like a high-ranking guy that can talk to Hitler and tell him things. But he died in February of 1942, just as the Americans are starting to come over in big waves. And he was replaced by Albert Speer, Speer. Speer really was good at improving the efficiency of arms production, but we saw a quote from Speer earlier in the book that says he was in love with Hitler, basically. He says he didn't join the Nazis because he thought all the ideas in the Nazi party was great. He joined the Nazis because he was mesmerized and hypnotized by Hitler. So he's going to be a yes man. He's going to do whatever Hitler tells him to do. He's not going to offer valid other perspectives and present them to Hitler the way this guy Fritz Todt did and say, look, we might not be able to win a war if the Americans get involved. Okay. Um, so by the time, the 1944 comes along, you've got the Soviets now fighting back and marching toward Berlin. You've got the Americans D-Day happens in June of 44, and that's really the beginning of the end. Okay. So we only got to 214, the very bottom, youth and education policies, and that will continue. We talked about youth groups. Then we got to talk about women. That's always a big bullet point in these, the impact of policies on women on 218. So hopefully the next video I can at least get to 220, and then maybe we'll do one more. Maybe it's going to be three videos, guys. We'll see how much. But today's Saturday. I'll make another one tomorrow. So try to watch them before our class on the 26th. Um, and if you have comments or feedback, let me know. And I hope this was helpful. Okay, thanks for watching. See ya.